Thank you very much, Aljaž. This is the last round table with some excellent personalities, renowned experts, which promises a very good and fruitful debate. Professor Andrej Rus is not with us, which is why we will try to present certain answers to the challenges posed by our panel session entitled Social State and New Social Contract for Slovenia. If you have been with us from the outset, you know that a lot has been said about the idea of UBI, how is this defined, how this should be implemented in practice, where we have certain solutions in this respect. And together with my guests, we will make an attempt to talk about the welfare social state. So this is the form of government where the state should play the key role when it comes to securing UBI. And when it comes to securing basic conditions for decent living for its citizens. And we will also make an attempt to come up with concrete proposal as to what this social contract for Slovenia in the 21st century should be defined. So Professor Tine Stanovnik, Dr. Andreja Černák-Meglič and Professor Ivan Svetlik. Maybe let us start with you, Mr. Svetlik. You are a sociologist, you are a professor at the Faculty of Social Sciences. You also are a former Minister of Labour, Family and Social Affairs. So let's put this concept into our current debate. We are talking about new solutions accustomed to the new time, the time we are living, and for the future. So what do you have to say? Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. At the outset, I will take this title and I will contribute to your debate as to what this new social contract for Slovenia should amount to. In my opinion, this new social contract should at least resolve two basic questions. The first question being the question of solidarity or the question of cohesion between social classes and social groups, most notably between different generations. Why? In my opinion, in times of crisis, this cohesion has been severely undermined. And then there is also another issue which should be added to this, namely the question of how to best mobilize all human resources in order to formulate clear objectives for resolving this situation. And of course, Slovenia is not isolated. The entire world is dealing with these upheavals and shocks. Why this second question? In my opinion, social cohesion comes at a certain price. We have social welfare programs, but this social cohesion cannot be maintained without having an appropriate economic basis to fund this. So we should deal with both issues in parallel. Let me now talk about UBI and, in my opinion, what I believe should be the contribution of UBI to this dilemma. I have to say that throughout these debates, I find this concept very nice. I believe that it offers certain solutions when it comes to universality, which is a very good and noble principle when it comes to social services. And then there is also one issue of transparency. Today I believe that I heard a number of convincing arguments, namely that UBI should also deal with the question of citizenship at European level and also at lower levels. Of course, it is not a panacea, but it could be a very good step in the right direction. Still, although I think this is a very good concept, we have problems if we talk about simply Slovene level. There is one problem, namely to what extent can we, with this idea, go beyond the problems of social cohesion. When it comes to UBI, we have two most important dilemmas. We lack funding, although some said that we have enough funds or assets to fund this. I think this is not enough if we want to make UBI a reality at an appropriate level, enabling us to have a decent living. If we make calculations, if we take into consideration the assets which today were put forward by Professor Valeria Koroshets, she presented fine arguments, and in this way I don't think that we have an adequate level. So if we talk about UBI amounting to 300 euro in Slovenia, this enables you to survive, but only in a short run. And you can just live with 300 euro within a short span. But if we talk about 450 euro in the long run, this is an amount which is flagged up, although this even is not enough if you want to live in the long run. So in this way, we need to have a lot more funds than we can find and we could find in line with the proposal put forward by Dr. Koroshets. And if we talk about more funds, as Professor Menzinger has said, either you have a person who has more funds, but we take these funds away from this person. Probably this should not be acceptable for any group which should be confronted with such a scenario, or there is another possibility, namely to raise taxes and income generated from taxes so that we have higher payload. And I believe that in today's time it will be very difficult to enforce. So this is the first problem. And then another issue, I will say it in simple terms, the problem of ethics, the problem of UBI and what impact does it have on work ethics. I believe that the matrix of value in Slovenia is such, maybe this is different for some Scandinavian Protestant countries, but when it comes to Slovenia, this work ethics is such that within a short period of time, provided we introduced UBI, this UBI should be would be regarded as some sort of right, and this right should be guaranteed by the state without feeling any sense of obligation. However, if we have different contributions or allowances, there are certain obligations which are coupled with these obligations. So when it comes to UBI and our sense of community, our sense of state, this is then subject to particular interest, and we are merely talking about our individual interest, and we are not dealing with community interests as such. So this is part of our matrix, and this goes hand in hand. We are highly individualistic as a society. So perhaps we can convince people to support UBI, yet it would be very difficult to persuade them to vote in such a way that they would also contribute to funding UBI. This also goes for a number of different areas, where in Slovenia we have a wide range of unwanted phenomena. Let me just mention a couple of those. So when it comes to UBI, this would quickly mean that it will act as it is the case with social transfers for unemployed. They are not high, but if you receive unemployment benefit and then you also work in the underground economy, you earn a couple of euro. If you combine both approaches, you are not even inclined to seek employment, to find a proper job. So in this way, you are stuck. In my opinion, the cultural matrix of Slovenia is not mature enough, or rather it is not appropriate to introduce similar instruments in this respect. But despite to go beyond this critical stance, I still feel that in order to have this new social contract for Slovenia, we do need more and not less social security. We need social security, and we particularly need responsible solidarity. And what do I mean when I say responsible solidarity? Two elements are very important. In the light of a uniform system, we still need to have conditionality when it comes to social allowances, and this also goes for UBI. UBI. So this unconditionality, in my opinion, should not and will not function well in Slovenia. And then another element of responsible solidarity. So every work, every labor, every job counts. And this is what we wanted to enforce when I was a minister, but then it was rejected when we had the Mini-Jobs Act. In this way, every job, every labor should be, of course, paid, and every job should be taxed, and based on this contribution, even if we are dealing with more precarious forms or types of labor, the people doing this should also be awarded social rights. And in my opinion, this principle offers some sort of untapped potential, which has not to date been exploited. And this is what I advocate. So in addition, I should say that we should have more welfare state, because the state is the only one who can enforce such instruments in practice. And in addition, we should also create development opportunities. And this is something the state or economy need within the globalized world. When it comes to economizing for development, we should invest in new technologies, we should support knowledge, and we should have niche production, we should mobilize human resources, we should have programs for social economy. This, in my opinion, is the so-called positive program, where we might seek alternatives, and this should be a basis to make a breakthrough, so we should exert pressure on global economy. Why am I saying this? I believe that any reform or any change, rather this is a European or a Sloven change or reform, should be put into the global context. We are part of a well-developed world, and if globalization will not be put an end to, and I believe this globalization will continue, because this will be at the detriment of developed countries. For that reason, we will be dealing for quite some time with a situation of low growth. We will be seeking a way out of this crisis. Against this backdrop, it is extremely important, and now I'm going back to this social contract, to have more social solidarity and not less. Because in a situation where the majority of people are not gaining but they are losing, the instruments of social solidarity in the light of social cohesion are very important. And I don't think there is any other way but to reinforce welfare state, to have more social security, more social programs. And in the light of economic circumstances, this could be feasible. And this is where I might finish. If I understood you correctly, you think that it is not necessary to introduce a new model for the welfare state, and that this model should be equipped to respond to heightened social insecurity, but rather you think that it might be a good idea to correct the existing system. Have I understood you correctly? Yes, you might say that. So when it comes to UBI and the role within this new society, do you think that UBI has a place within this new social contract or not? As I have said, as a principle, I do not object this idea of UBI. However, I do have problems with it because I don't see a possibility how we might best implement this concept in practice. I have indicated two reasons. First, the question of funding, and the second issue being issue of matrix of values. At least I'm speaking about Slovenia. I don't know whether this is also the case for some other country. It is difficult to say. But when it comes to southeastern part of Europe, they have problems with their relationship toward the common goods, toward the state. The entire area or region has problems when it comes to informal work, underground economy, etc. And against this backdrop, UBI is a problematic solution. Thank you very much.
Dr. Andrea Črnak-Meglič is also a sociologist, an MP for the Social Democrats. For UBI, we see that it gradually goes from the alternative into mainstream discussions. You've been a member of the parliament for a number of years now. What's your impression? What's going on in the political world and in the society, since you've been here attending the conference from the very beginning? Well, I'm convinced that there are a number of members of the parliament who don't know what UBI is. Secondly, at the moment, we are dealing with completely different questions than thinking about how UBI can contribute the social state. I believe that what we are dealing with at the moment and what goes with the new social contract is definitely the question of the relationship between the social security, which has to be modernized, and for which in Slovenia we know that we are lagging behind what's been happening in other comparable states. And second part, which is the active component of a social state. We could call it social investments, which actually is based on strengthening the individual, the family, the society, so that it finds it easier to face social risks on one hand and processes of globalization on the other. It actually counts on an individual becoming more active in resolving their own situation and their family. Therefore, one needs to invest into an individual, and these investments are reflected in the fact that we recognize and strengthen preschool, quality preschool education, equalizing the chances of children, quality learning in school and lifelong learning, active employment policy, as well as harmonizing family and vocational obligations. This is a trend, a strategy that was already introduced in the Lisbon strategy as well as Agenda 2020. Nevertheless, it seems that it is losing its impetus in Slovenia. I think Masha Kucipar is still here. We are faced with the latest proposals of the government. On one hand, everything is reflected in not daring approaches to modernization of social security. Very quickly, I can mention the pension reform, which is being made predominantly within the coalition and trade unions representing the industrial worker. This will be a reform of very quick span. It will not be effective, and it will transpose the burden onto the future generations. That's one part of the story. The second one refers to the reform of labor market, which in some way is still not responsive enough, not responding to the fact that the young, with their inclusion, represent the category of new risks. So it does not enable equal entry onto the labor market to them. That's one part. And yet the second one is even more worrying, which is legalization of the importance of social investments. Where do I see it? If you looked at the law on harmonizing public finance, you could see over there already how there's more and more pressure onto the public sector. When moving on to a new budget, we can see that this pressure on the public sector is stronger and stronger, gradually growing in the areas that should at the least be burdened, which is education and development. Science minus 70%, education minus 15%, and so on and so forth. The second thing, which is quite worrying, is that we are lowering the average amount for municipalities, which means that municipalities that have their own burden of sustaining preschool education, this amounts to 38% of expenses for social activities and 15% of the total budget of the municipalities. You can imagine how they will react. It will definitely be hand in hand with what was already mentioned yesterday by Prime Minister into lowering the standardized norm. So the third trend that hasn't come to the front row so much is the trend that is reflected in the tendency for reforming public sector, in order to open the door for the private sector. Partially, this is shown by less resources. On the other hand, There are ideas as to how to reform things. For example, some ideas that are now circulating in the debates are the ideas about completely removing the awarding of concessions for health, and that the user can decide what services to use and where to use them, which means, in simple terms, the medium class will run to the private sector. By doing so, it will impoverish the backbone of the public system and threaten the core of the social state, because we know that the impetus and strengthening of the social state, the welfare state, will be possible once it was supported by the medium class, the middle class, agreeing to more burdens, of course. One more thing, Slovenia has never come across detrimental consequences of privatization, liberalization compared to other post-socialist states. We had this gradual transition of the welfare state, where this duality grew stronger. On one hand, we followed the example of the social security system, following the example of continental Europe, and on the other hand, the service sector, social democratic social sector, service sector, following the example of Scandinavian states. But with the tendencies on the table now, I believe that these pillars are being shaken. To begin with, we need to strengthen our endeavors to reintroduce a clever system of social security. On the other hand, continue the trends of social investments, which proven contribute to better employment, create better quality of working posts, and of course, better harmonization of vocational and family obligations, family life. In this way, they are more oriented into the younger generation. I truly love the UBI idea. When preparing my doctor's thesis, I read Livkin, and I was inspired by this idea. On the other hand, I have to agree with Professor Svetlik. On one hand, we need to be aware of our value system. Maybe all of us missed the opportunity to ask Professor Van Parijs why in the Netherlands, when they were very close to introducing UBI, why they failed to do so. There was the biggest problem in the system of values, from what I understand. Secondly, having a critical mass of advocates and their representation at different levels, I predominantly agree that here the European level is important, and the third problem is the problem of financing. Unfortunately, we need to look at the proportion between the forces, because the capital here is prevalent. Therefore, we had money for the banks, and there is no money for other things. Thank you. It seems to me that you became really excited talking about looking for consensus. Am I correct to say that the political, ideological differences on the political arena seem to be bigger and bigger day in, day out? Yes. So tell me now, how are we in the current situation reach the agreement on social changes if the polarization within the society is so huge? I believe it was almost a year ago when I had a very positive experience, and you were a part of that. Together with a colleague, Ziegel, I was a member of the youth organization when we built some umbrella organization combining the interests of the forces in favor of positive changes. We organized it on the occasion of the Family Code. I have to say that such synergy and positive energy of people coming from different political parties, different civil society organizations, well, I've never seen that again. Unfortunately, the story had an unhappy ending. The Family Code was not adopted. And I was wondering whether we could start something like that in our endeavors to set up a social state. I believe there's huge potential there. So building bottom-up approach with the campaign, yes, that's quite weird from a politician to say.
This is also Professor Tine Stanovnik, who is the only economist here. I see that you have prepared quite many notes. You took notes when we were listening to our previous speakers. So please tell us, what is the mood between economists when it comes to introducing UBI? Thank you very much for giving me the floor. Indeed, you are right. I have been scribbling very diligently as a student, and I have to say that this indeed was an exceptional conference, eminent experts, and I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate the organizers. This was a pleasure indeed, and I believe that many agree with me that we really enjoyed good and well-presented arguments. So when it comes to economists, I have been provoked because we do have divergent views as a group. I'm more inclined to subscribe to Professor Menziger's view. Yet one thing should be added here, namely, whether it is possible to introduce UBI without having a comprehensive and progressive agenda on our table. Because often we hear, well, this is not a very important obstacle. We could introduce UBI. Even if you talk about social security system, what might this amount to? What does this mean for social security? And I do believe that it is necessary to have a complementary and progressive agenda, regardless of all the documents such as the Lisbon Strategy, Europe 2020, etc. We do not have such a progressive agenda in Europe. And this agenda should help us to not just neutralize, but also, if you wish, we should launch a counterattack against neoliberalistic policies. Because neoliberalism, simplified, is in fact a planned or long-term plan to undermine the power of the state. And of course, this goes very well with globalization. It is detrimental for the welfare state in the long run. Well, Guy, in fact, flagged up one name, Karl Polai. He is very important, but he is often overlooked, a great thinker, a great economist. And throughout history, he showed that we have seen the boom of market economy, which in fact launched an attack against the state. And in order to protect itself, the state had to establish institutions in order to launch a counterattack against unbridled forces of market economy. We know that in the 19th century they introduced the social security system, so as a shield of stability, as a shield preventing free flow of market economy. But what we are seeing today, in my opinion, with this globalization, is once again the wave, or rather it opened up the source, the unbridled force of capital, free flow of goods and services. Therefore, there is a need to create powerful pillars of stability within national economies and nation states. But having said that, do not have a systemic approach as it was the case in the past. They had social security institutions, but what Professor Pertot might say, this is reflectionary interventionism. So economists have certain reservations, and I really do not know of any serious economist who might unconditionally support the introduction of UBI. Anthony Atkinson, a very renowned economist, is absolutely in favor of UBI, but with certain conditions attached to it. What do I mean? We heard in the morning we should have the so-called community service, so socially beneficial work. So not just work within the formal sector, but service that might benefit the community as a whole. So unconditional UBI, in my opinion, at least among economists, is something which doesn't hold water and is not well embraced. And another thing, when it comes to the introduction of UBI, when it comes to how it impacts the system of social security and insurance. We know that some states are very close to the so-called partial UBI, so UBI awarded to certain categories of population, and this if you integrate this within the philosophy of social security and insurance, you know that you have certain groups, vulnerable groups, which are well protected. Or if you have somebody who work for them, we assume that they earn a decent income and they do not need UBI. I believe that when it comes to partial UBI, we have huge possibilities. This is a potential to tap into. And Slovenia was in fact very close to introduce UBI for children. There was one period in the past where, similar to the Netherlands, they were in favor of general UBI, and this was very close, but then Slovenia also had a possibility to introduce UBI for children. And I believe that in a very relatively near future, there will be a need to reflect upon some sort of UBI for the elderly, those who are older than 65. To put it in simple terms, a pension should no longer be a system of social security, but this will be just one part of the sum, and the other part of the sum will depend on contributions. So we will have a combined approach. In this sense, UBI would amount to huge redistribution. For example, Switzerland or the Netherlands have some sort of system. Slovenia had a state pension, but we know that now state pensions have to a large extent been reduced. But there is also one problem, because UBI as such should be funded via taxation and not via contributions, because the Czech Constitutional Court ruled that this part or this concept is redistributionary and that it should be funded via contributions and not the other way around. So maybe this partial approach might be the right solution. If we don't have a comprehensive advanced agenda, at least we should tackle critical problems. And when it comes to children and the elderly, this might be the two most vulnerable groups. Of course, we also have a problem of precariat, without any doubt. Yet maybe this might be the right approach. So within a short period of time, we should make progress, of course, if we put forward such a solution. And I believe that we could achieve this. Maybe Andrea might tell us why in the past we abandoned UBI for children, because you were a strong advocate for the introduction of UBI for children. But when you talk about general unconditional UBI, I'm not in favor of that, but I do support UBI for certain categories of population. And then we should upgrade the concept, we should expand this pool. Very well, you are a researcher, and you analyze social inequalities, and also you analyze the systems of social security. What trends have you observed? Well, when it comes to trends, when it comes to social inequality, the question is what could happen in Slovenia. Although we are well known as a stable country, but of course you probably know that things are deteriorating, especially when it comes to poverty, the risk of being poor. This also goes for inequality. And in terms of social policies, we also have problems. Because in times of an economic crisis, it is quite clear and it could be accepted and expected that this situation will deteriorate even further. However, the continental Europe has a very important public sector, and they function as a system which is in fact a stabilizing force. So this idea, and here I completely subscribe to Professor Metzger's view, what is happening in Slovenia today is a policy which deliberately weakens the public sector. And in the long run, this might lead to huge damage for the entire state of Slovenia. Why? Just one thing, if I may. By saying that the public sector is a whole and you merely fund this, no. It creates public goods serving the community. And this is one form of UBI, if you wish, for schooling, education, for the health sector. And in this respect, a powerful power sector, if it is efficient, of course. And just one thing, you have inefficient private sector, and if this is the case, you will also have inefficient public sector. This goes hand in hand. So on one hand, we have the public sector, which is being severely criticized. On the other hand, we talked a lot about lean companies, about efficiency. So when managers talk about lean economies, lean companies, do you think that they overlook this ethical component? Well, I will say this. There is one huge problem. We talked a lot about precariat, but there is also one huge problem, namely employment. Employment, how to create new jobs. This is a huge problem. Personally, I don't think there is a solution on the horizon when it comes to employment, but if you want to create jobs, then many jobs will have to be characterized by low productivity. I'm not saying that we will have merely highly productive jobs, but it is a must to create this sector as well. When it comes to a small state, it is detrimental to have high unemployment rates. In terms of social policies, this leads to great problems for social cohesion. So I think that when it comes to employers, as President Obama commended an employer in Michigan who, despite the economic crisis, didn't lay off a single worker. And in my opinion, a good employer is such who maintains the current level, making an attempt to adapt to the current situation of crisis, but to maintain a relatively high level of employment should be one of economic imperatives, in my opinion, for our government in Slovenia as well. Thank you.
Professor Svetlik, this summer you published a series of essays in one of Slovenian newspapers in reference to the topic of values, talking about the social state and UBI having to follow a collectivistic spirit. On the other hand, the research shows that we are becoming more and more individualistic. I think you wrote something about that. What is your comment? Well, that's exactly what I wanted to comment on before already. I believe that we are faced with a problem in our country that with such changes, well, we do not have appropriate value basis for such changes. According to some indicative research, one can say that we have extremely high individualism, that our attitude towards the common, the universal, is truly low and bad, and that the state is always the scapegoat for everything. The state is responsible for everything and should give everything. Yet our endeavors to pay taxes and contributions to report on our economic activities are literally low because the state is not valued. And we are completely different from the Scandinavians, for example, who have always protected and defended a social state at this value level. Of course, we wish for security, more equality. This is what UBI would offer. But within the hierarchy of these values, I believe that this particularism and individualism are much stronger than the latter. Particularism brings in the duality where we expect to be given security from the state, yet we are not willing to do something in order to make it happen. Further on, I talked about the values, that is concentrating on the present rather than the future. With all the reform, we wish to ensure the safety for future generations as well. But most people are only looking at this moment now, what they will benefit at this point in time now, and this is rather critical. Since I have the floor, let me also say the following. Our discourse about UBI should somewhat be connected also to the discussion in that part of the social state that is found in the services of the social state, since this is where usually universal solutions are found. Universal access to education for all through the services ensured by the state is extremely important. And if I had to decide whether I will introduce UBI and give cash into the hands of an individual, or to enable to an individual free access to children's care and care in school, I would definitely give advantage to the latter, not to the cash. Further on, we have problem with what people will do with that money. An anomaly that we know, and colleague Černač will confirm this. Some families, for example, used child allowances, somewhat cash, for the family, and they spend it, for example, to build their standard, rather than investing into the development of children. So I believe that in a way the state has to intervene with the services that it offers, especially the ones that are necessary for the development of the younger generation, and something similar stands true for the older generation. So if somebody gets an income, there is a question, who will spend it and how? Dr. Černač, I think you spoke about that as well. What services should be ensured by the social state? We can see that the interpretations of it vary state to state. So which services? Or maybe one more question. Do you think that Slovenia is a people-friendly state? Well, it's hard to say. As for services, of course, the state, via public services, should ensure what is most important for equal access to the basic elements that will enable an individual to be equally participating in the society. Without a doubt, this is quality childcare, education, health, and so on. I think that I was rather critical, but Slovenia developed extremely big public sector. On the other hand, it did not recognize the potential of non-government sector, which, with the regulation of the state, telling them what they should do under what conditions, can actually complementary add to the services of public sector following the same goal, which is public good. This pluralization of welfare state in Slovenia was something we did not experience. Looking at the public sector, it practically remained unchanged throughout this whole period of time. There were new and new needs occurring, and actually non-governmental sector was not given the chance to fulfill these services. And this is where we could ensure, through that part of non-governmental sector that we call social companies, social entrepreneurship, where the primary part of activities is ensuring services and goods for the users. And this huge potential in these people, as well as in voluntary work, cannot be utilized for certain needs for which that are not so necessarily provided by the public sector. They could be do it as an extended hand of the state, in a way, as some shadow state, as some call it. And it turned out to be a very good practice in some other countries, because there are some advantages to how they respond to the needs of people. But definitely the state sector and non-governmental sector are twins. So the social state is kind, but, well, if you ask people, now they will say the social state is gone, the state is not kind. But I think this is an unjust view. Slovenia, with its gradual development until now, still managed to preserve a huge proportion of the social state. And the indicators that colleague Stanonik talked about, the level of danger for poverty, for example, 50% the threshold of poverty lowers due to the social state. So for Christ's sake, this means something. Slovenia has one of the lowest risk for poverty for children because of huge redistribution potential of social state, and so on, not to even talk about the index of human development. So we shouldn't be really too strictly critical. It is true that we are, on the other hand, at the crossroad. We're at the point where we can destroy what is most important.
Professor Stanonik, if we talk about basic conditions which need to be fulfilled if Slovenia is to be the social state, is economic, human and political development. It seems that now we are at the crossroads, and in 2008 Slovenia was affected more when compared to other countries. We were regarded as the story of success, but now we have entered into a different category. Where have we done wrong, in your opinion? Well, it is very easy to be smart today if you talk about past mistakes, although many economists who addressed these issues pointed to the certain vulnerability of the Slovene economy. They said that labor intensity is too big and we compensated for lower productivity with this. And then there was also one problem. Technological production was not sustainable, and it is not coupled with the processes of globalization. We also made quite a number of mistakes when it comes to economic and fiscal policies. You probably know, or probably you don't know, that in the period from 2004 to 2008, we made a number of blunders, especially when it comes to economic and fiscal measures. So where we are today as Slovenia, as Professor Mencigor said, we don't know how this crisis will turn out to be in Europe. We don't know whether we will come out of the crisis or not. I'm not just referring to the problem the common currency and the euro area are confronted with, but I'm speaking in general terms about a financial and economic crisis. We don't see an end to it. We don't know how this will end. We don't know what will be the pace of this crisis. You might say that in 2014, everybody says the forecasts are that economic growth will be positive. Just look how things were in future or in history. They will say one thing good, one thing bad, but we know that things are moving into a different direction. And this is the third year of this crisis. And we have very poor numbers, indeed, in terms of growth. I don't know how things will turn out to be. But as Andrea said very well, we are indeed at a crossroads. Why? This is not just an impression, but we have hard figures, hard measures, and we have measures which deliberately undermine the functioning of the state, especially now where this should not be done, but there is a plan to undermine the state. This also goes for social policies, and I believe that there is a huge threat in the long-run development, because this, in fact, is something you cannot just recover overnight, even if you have economic growth. So I believe that in this period of time we have made a couple of blunders, huge blunders, which could have a detrimentally negative impact. But when will things reverse? When will trends reverse? Well, I really do not know that. Even the Office for Macroeconomic Development Analysis cannot predict this, let alone me. Professor Svetlik, you were a Minister of Labour, Family and Social Affairs in the previous government, especially in times of the crisis. What do you think? What about the room for public debate? Was it more or less close to such ideas from the margins, so to speak? Well, I will be quite critical, because those who came up with the proposal might say that we didn't take any proposals on board, but those who were in the government might say that when it comes to the pension reform, we had more than 50 meetings with social partners. Whether this is enough or not, well, it is difficult to say. But I have to say one thing. You have put this question to me, and as the government, from day one, when we took on office, we were confronted with a crisis. This happened at the end of 2008, beginning of 2009. We knew what awaited us, and unfortunately, all forecasts which were put forward by us are now coming into reality. We said that we need to afford protection protection to our population. We need to protect the population against the negative impact of a crisis. So we heightened or we increased the level of social transfers. We awarded aid to companies in order to deal with the crisis. But of course, in the long run, we said that in terms of costs, in terms of expenditure, this is not sustainable. So this buffer instruments will not be adequate in the long run. Therefore, we need to introduce structural reforms. And this is an idea we have embraced, and we have prepared these reforms within a short span. Why am I saying this? There was a necessity to come up with solutions very quickly, and this didn't allow for us to debate longer, to have long debates, to persuade people. But we were quite clear, and we also forecasted that unless reforms will be adopted, then the next phase will be even more difficult. And this is the situation we are dealing with today. We are seeking solutions, although the situation is more serious than it was 2 years ago. Had we accepted these reforms, today's solutions would be less strict, and they would complement our solutions very well. In a nutshell, of course, it is difficult to say whether our government was more or less open to suggestions, to public debates, to initiatives, etc. My colleague Valeria Koroshets at that time proposed the introduction of UBI. I recall that we had a debate on social reform packages. Unfortunately, however, the judgment was such that this is not feasible and that we cannot take this on board. Before we open the floor to other participants, just one question. Professor Stanovnik, you speak about different indices to measure economic performance of individual states, and once we do this, we always talk about GDP, so this is our starting point. The Kingdom of Bhutan, many years ago, started to measure and introduce the index of happiness. They had a conference in June, and the United Nations had a conference on sustainable development. We heard that we should introduce such an index that should measure more than just GDP, so that we should go beyond GDP. And this should also reflect happiness, satisfaction in different states. In your opinion, or rather, I am addressing this question to all three. Gallup's research poll included hundreds of states throughout the world, and the happiest people are in Denmark, Finland, and Slovenia is ranked 49th. So what do you think about such an index that should measure a lot more than GDP? How do you respond to this? Well, when it comes to deficiencies of GDP, they are well known, and any economist could speak about that for hours. Of course, the worst possible thing is that this is just a number, and this number doesn't reflect the quality of life. For that reason, we have a number of complementary indices, such as Human Development Index being one index, and then we also have a wide range of different social indicators. And probably you know, and let me also mention not just this index of happiness, or what you referred to just now. This is a huge potential. Amartya Sen and Joseph Stiglitz, two Nobel laureates, and there was also a third individual. This was a very important initiative, very important report, and they put forward very concrete and tangible improvements on how to best measure prosperity. This is very important because we know that GDP is not an indicator which might reveal prosperity and development, especially if you have an unequal distribution of income, then GDP is not relevant. We know, for example, that in the States, we have mediana household income, and this has not been changed for about 30 years, which is quite incredible. although we know that the upper percent went sky high. They earn quite a lot. But when it comes to implementation, well, it should be questioned to what extent these new indices should measure not just economic prosperity and whether they are adequate to compensate for GDP. This is an outstanding issue. Although if two Nobel laureates are important advocates, then it might be a good idea to reflect on other options next to GDP. So we should have other economic indicators, not just social indicators, but we should have a complete picture. Please? Andrea or Mr. Svetlik? Would you like to add anything? Yes, if I may. The OECD also offered one solution. I don't know whether this is good life or some sort of other indicators. I do believe that we should complement these indicators and we should measure different types of development throughout time, and we should compare states. It is interesting to know that Slovenia, when it comes to human development, is very high on this scale, and also when it comes to the good standard of living. I believe that we are ranked 20th or 22nd among all the states which are listed. But of course you need to be cautious when we speak about very subjective assessments such as the index of happiness. But it's very important to know that when you talk about social science research, here it was revealed that you have a certain matrix of values, because Scandinavian countries, Northern European countries are more satisfied when compared to Southeast. So this is a problem of comparison. How do you rate this happiness? So if this is something which is permanently present within your culture, within your lifestyle. And another thing, there's also one problem pertaining to such indices. Of course, you cannot increase happiness year in, year out, because this indicator is not sustainable in the long run. And maybe then the indicator is not stimulative enough, and it could not be used within public discourses. In your opinion, when it comes to social state, should this be linked to the rate of employment among the young? So this ratio between pensioners and young is 1.4 to 1, and then in the future we will have 0.8. So whether this social state should also be coupled with the ratio between young people and pensioners, and the young supporting these pensioners. In the long run, I do believe this is a very complex task indeed, and in my opinion, no developed country came up with the right solution to this problem of demography. And you have revealed this with numbers. Of course, the current answer being that we are the aging society, we will work longer, but probably this also has a certain limit. And the question is, how should we come up with this new social contract? How should we maintain this intergenerational solidarity in order to prevent conflicts between generations? So in line with these forecasts, we should know where this limit lies. I'm not just speaking about pensions, but there are also some other problems, for example, allowances for the elderly. And the pension system is merely being corrected in order to alleviate negative trends, but probably in the long run, very quickly. I believe this is high time that we seek alternative solutions, and we need intergenerational solidarity. And this solidarity will be, in my opinion, very different. I do not know. I have not been able to come up with the right answer, and I was not able to offer right solutions. Neoliberal concepts, of course, talk about individual investments, about individual care, but this doesn't resolve this problem, at least not at present, if we talk about the aging society, because they have contributed to this solidarity and they expected for this solidarity to prevail. So when you talk about the medium-term prospect, well, it is difficult to talk about the long run, because probably when it comes to this perception and forecast, so when we talk about this midterm period, it is a must to have this insurance for long-term care. This should be part and parcel of obligatory insurance. Based on this, the elderly might have a possibility to fund services they need. Unless we did this, what might happen? The burden will be once again transferred to females. Because today our research, and we have been coming up with these numbers, so women are burdened more. Of course, women work longer, especially in the informal sector. They care for the elderly. European trends also reveal that this burden is being transferred to females. And it is not wise to leave these trends aside. We should react. We also had a draft act on long-term care. It has practically been well coordinated, but then time was working against us, and this was not approved. But of course, as I have said, we should also think about active engagement of other types of activities, such as services which could be provided by NGOs, social companies. But for that, you also need to have a certain amount of funding. This will not happen overnight. Of course, we talk about the fact that some will have to work longer. We have long queues of those people who are not even in a position to get a job. So a question to all, do you think that this new social contract for Slovenia should also incorporate shorter work time, in your opinion?
Well, if you're looking at me, the idea of shortening the working time has always been an attractive one, yet it has always brought along with it the question of economic output, which would ensure sustainability of a social state and social programs in simplest terms. It is in a way a redistribution of existent work. I wouldn't still abolish, especially in the small economy, which should be adaptable, flexible. I would not abolish an idea in Slovenia where, in spite of huge global pressure of competitors, we need to look for windows of opportunity for us. I see it in a higher level of education, training, skills, competencies, technological investments. As for the companies with the so-called zero production, we have a few extremely good examples of companies as a niche programs where they succeeded globally, covering some 10% of global needs. And this strategy would be probably still good enough for a small economy such as ours. And this also leads into ensuring working posts. We will definitely need those if we wish to sustain the system. On the other hand, if we follow the path of shrinking the social state, putting pressure of the system, then of course we will not have new working posts. And the current government we lack these measures. They are not existent. Everything is now concentrated on austerity measures rather than opening new possibilities for the development of employment. On the other hand, it has to be said that our experience is the following. The so-called tax reliefs that we witnessed in the previous government under Prime Minister Janša that are intended for the companies and development did not go into practice. This extra money went into the programs of privatization that were hand in hand with bank loans rather than government going into new technologies. So actually, this was a period of immature capitalism where new owners and managers behaved not as the agents of capital in the good sense of the word, taking care of accumulation for development and new working employment positions, but as the robbers of capital because they were looking for personal benefit. So this general instrument of benefits did not succeed. I can say, even though this was not my area under the previous government, we did succeed to have a shift in technological investments in the sense of increased export of such products, in the sense of better innovativeness, with the targeted technological development of the companies. And this is where I see an opportunity for this economy. But of course, I don't see it in what these days is demanded. At the time of our government, it was also called for on behalf of even some international organizations that we need to compete with a low price of working force. Of course, we can never be competitive with India in that respect. Is it possible to come up with new ideas, talking about shortened period of working time? Well, France went along that path and came back, even though it cannot be excluded, and this is a problem. It is true that what Bert Mari said at one conference, the labor-rich countries are different to the countries without offering some work. But Slovenia has had rather anemic labor market lately. And this problem, in comparison to Austria, for example, is such that, well, I'm not sure if this can be one of the measures to shorten the working time. I don't think so. But the problem is actually in creating employment possibilities. And I believe it can only be within the private sector. Thank you very much. It is time for questions from the audience. Please introduce yourself and limit your comments to some sensible time frame. I will try to limit myself to time. We definitely waited for a long time to raise questions from the audience, so I will take some time. I have to say that I'm really surprised that today I agree more with the economists than Slovene sociologists. I find common points even with Dr. Stanovnik when he talks about the possibilities of introducing UBI, especially in reference to the partial system. I said yes to that. Yes, universal child allowance would be the first most necessary step in this time of crisis. I have to say that within my proposal, I'm not sure if only in working version or the final one, I talk about the universal approach to the pension system, where I stand for identical ideas presented by Dr. Stanovnik. We have one part in universal pension, the second one dependent on the contributions paid. So the question, please? Well, I will not raise questions. I will make comments. What I want to say is that I wish to say that I think that this generation, which lived in relatively more optimistic time, cannot expect from precarians right now to support any kind of, let me say, positive changes on the pension system unless the position of precarious young labor force is taken into account. Thank God we have some minimum consensus in the universal child allowance, but as a mid-aged generation, I can tell you that will not provide support to the pensioners unless they support us. Ms. Meglic talked about the non-governmental sector and how many NGOs we have employing one or two persons. And then at the same time, she negates the positive value of UBI, which is unconditional because we have to control and activate people. But we know why the non-governmental sector is inefficient, because they spend so much time to write applications to stay on the market, and they do nothing for the others because they keep writing applications for them to be NGOs. There's an anarchist who tried to get in contact, well, not an anarchist, an alternative man in Maribor. They said, we have no time. We are writing projects. They have no time to do the things that they exist for. Talking about schemes proposed by Dr. Svetlik, when he didn't trust an individual to find dignified, stimulating work, but he gave the money to preserve working posts to middle management, in other words, to entrepreneurs, those who haven't shown anything in the respect of protecting human rights and dignified work, which means that the question is, why don't you trust an individual? But you said it yourself, you just don't. And then your colleague, equally so. You have a bad opinion on the moral values of people in Slovenia. But I'm afraid to say I don't agree with you. So, my opinion and your opinion doesn't count. But the point is, we can no longer talk about I think. Yes, it's probably so. I call upon Dr. Svetlik that every time he says it is not possible, it is probably so, to start operating with figures, research of public opinion, and then we shall have a discussion. I have to say something else. Please, can you conclude? Yes, I will. This is the last thing I wish to say. All the time we thought how we are incapable of getting into their heads. But guys standing Philly Van Paris did not succeed to change their opinion, then I will say, well, this is how it is. But truly, just one more thing. How you feel in the parliament when you talk to the deaf. In other words, to the right party, this is how we feel when we talk about UBI talking to you. And I believe that in the future, this will be the dividing point for those of us who believe that people are active, are hardworking, are capable of taking care of themselves, and the others who think that they have to be paternalistic. Well, of course, I wish to respond in reference to the universal child allowance. The lady probably doesn't know, but I was practically among those who led the campaign in favor of introduction of universal child allowance, and actually in the legislative framework of the law on family relations, it was actually introduced in it. But unfortunately, the later governments who possessed with this instrument realized that simply there is no money for that, and they refrained from the model. That's exactly what happened. But what is interesting is that in the movement that we ran through the Association of the Youth of Slovenia, we succeeded. It happened for the first time that we gathered signatures of the public. It was more than 60,000 signatures that we collected, with which we came to the parliament, and on the basis of that, all political parties opened the idea of the universal child allowance. This was in 1996. In 1999, there was an audit of it, a revision of it, due to different political system, not to talk about who we agree with and who we are against. And if I'm an advocate of that, I'm still one today. I'm a little bit more reluctant with the pensions, because what I fear is that this will lead into NDC, which means, you see, one has to look at what it means. If we reallocate the current income, we will still have to ensure pensions for those who will not go to the new system. At the same time, we need to ensure additional resources for new ones. And in the contribution rate that we have today, we will find that provided that this nil pillar, unless the universal income for the elderly is raised, the future pensions will be very low. I still believe we have to move within the reality and the proportion between, on one hand, between the active population and the dependent population is growing. And unfortunately, in a way, we can say, unfortunately, their life expectancy is longer. As for NGOs, it is a fact that I belong among the group of people which did huge research in NGOs. By the way, I have doctor's degree in that. And what I meant about regulation and participation and cooperation between governmental and non-governmental sector, what I meant is that the state defines standards and norms under which activities are ensured, and they are financed in approximately the same way. But we can't mix it up with what is happening these days, which means the system I stand for is a completely different system of financing, which is in a way a concession. But what is happening now is annual tenders and calls for proposals, and this is what I've been against for all my life, trying to influence those who are decision makers to change the system. Some systems have that. For example, the area of social security has multi-annual contracts, the city of Ljubljana has multi-annual contracts, and so on and so forth. So if you get a lot, you have to agree that the one giving the resources has the right to see how these resources are used. That's completely normal. And even though I'm one of the biggest advocates of that sector, I have to say that not everything that glitters is gold. We have to admit that. In the non-governmental sector, we had a number of scandals when it was found that not everything was used for what it should be. So I believe there was a question on this side. Yes. I thought there would be more people responding because there were a number of questions raised to it. All panelists, thank you for the floor. I believe it is only right for me to thank you. I listened with great interest to what you said, and my feelings kept changing throughout the discourse. In the beginning, I felt as if I was listening to three advocates of gradual introduction of the idea of UBI. The more I listened, the more it seems to me that the reservations kept piling up, so that at the end I can doubt that you are advocates of UBI, even though I believe Dr. Svetlik declared to be an advocate. The moment when I had major doubts in your case was when you said that the advantage before the UBI in cash was given to some service on your behalf. This is where I believe that, of course, your view ended up being different. It seems to me that Professor Stanonik had the least of this duality, but I believe that there is some duality that you have to raise a question to yourself whether you are in favor or against this idea. There are many of us talking about graduality, and we support it. So we would agree with gradual introduction, be it according to groups or the amount or the scope of its introduction and so on. I do have a specific question for Dr. Svetlik. A question tackling the strategy we're talking about. In reference to Ms. Meglic, well, you said the social state depends, or actually pensions depend on the relationship pensioner employee. How precise is that? I think they also depend on productivity and average added value brought by the employee. And this is what I wanted to mention as a starting point for my question addressed to Dr. Svetlik. Well, the working positions can be supported also by giving money to those who employ, so that they employ people who have low productivity, working in working posts with less added value, who don't have special motivation, and they will produce badly. Most probably they will produce loss. So time and time again, things will have to be covered by new subsidies to the employers who will hire labor force. I wonder if this is a good system. At the time when you were in government, is this what you were doing? And I'm wondering whether this is something you would do again, or would you make some different choices with the predisposition? Maybe I'm wrong when I say that the added value is produced by people who are capable of adding huge added value, and that working positions will no longer be so many. So the future is not a future of the society filled with employment, but partial employment, because working positions will never be sufficient. So the working positions have to be given to those who will be highly stimulated, because only those will have the capacity that will be a precondition for them to produce high added value on that working position. And this working position should be given to them provided that they stay stimulated. If not, they should leave it to others. And the rest, with this highly added value, can be preserved on some minimum and some average amount of UBI. Thank you for answering. I believe that the idea of the universal basic income has to be worked with all the time. Graduality. So if we introduced it overnight, I don't think it's possible, but the idea of going first to the level of the European Union, through it, implement this idea, to me seems rather more attractive, because I'm not so aware of the details at that level, compared to going into one individual state like Slovenia. But I see two basic problems, as I've said before. The first problem is mobilization of sufficient amount of resources, which means either bigger redistribution, which I find hard to imagine technically how it could be done, in the sense of very rich to be taken enough, because we don't have, at least apparently not, many very rich people unless they are hiding. And the second possibility of redistribution is such that we would in general burden people with contributions and taxes, and in this way we would mobilize these additional resources. What I'm convinced by, that it is better to follow the path of selectiveness compared to the current social system, is that with existent resources we can have better social impacts, in simple terms. Since if we add, what I tried to say before, if we give 300 euros to each citizen, we should give them more for those who have nothing to survive, at least 450 or 500 euros. And then, only then, well, to begin with, we lack resources, right? And then with 300 euros, we would have to add some additional social transfers. So we did nothing in the sense of simplifying this system, neither in the sense of improving the position and situation of the poorest, most socially threatened population, while to the richest, they don't care, because what they get, it will be taken away from them. From what I understand, it would only be transferred from one pocket to another. In that respect, I don't see the impact. With existent resources, I still think it's more rational to give support to those who have no other way out, rather than mixing into the story those who can simply take care of themselves. Of course, there's a different momentum here, which I find attractive. For example, will social citizenship be strengthened at the European level, at the Slovenian level? I find this idea a very interesting one, worth working on. I believe it can, if we persist in that direction, it can bring a shift in the way of organization of our society. The second question, as I said, is the question of ethics of work. What does this mean for the ethics of work and the phenomena that we have an opportunity to observe? It says that probably it would be additionally burdened with such instrument. I would dare say this not only on the basis of my beliefs, as colleague Koroshet said, but we have some research that was made about how Slovenians value what we value in our lives and how we behave with these values. That's the second biggest question, and I believe that this is the question where the Dutch stopped wishing to introduce something more radical, and many others as well. In the discourse, I've already touched upon this question. If we went along this path radically to link the role of the individual onto the status of a citizen and look at the position of an individual and the group from what they put from their input through work, then we would radically change the society, but we don't know how to predict all the consequences. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't try anything, far from it, but I'm rather skeptical. If the statics of the work dropped, of course, then the sources to feed the UBI would fall as well. And this is what would be a vicious circle. And some research that we're aware of at the wider European level show that already now we have a shift from the ethics of work to aesthetics of work, which means that the younger generation wishes to, well, is not willing to accept just any work. That has to be done so that an individual and the society as a whole functions. But the youth are really picky. Of course, they have the right to be, and they are looking for quality work. But the question remains as to who will then perform these duties and works. In that sense, I believe there are a number of dilemmas that would have to be resolved before we would say, yes, let us make that decisive step in the sense of introducing universal basic income. It is, on the other hand, very interesting to think about it, whether we shall remain the society of working people, or the technology will replace our work and we'll have to make the conditions so that we all can survive with less work. Yet, today in the global world, this is a global question. And it's hard for an individual country to make that decision, as we could see France decided and yet changed its mind later on. So in Europe, one community like European Union can make that decision, but in the global competitiveness, it would take a huge risk in this world, because it would have to compensate this with better productivity and competitiveness and investment into knowledge. And in China, they have very cheap labor force to compete with. So we would have to come to a conclusion that would be fit for a political decision at the level of the state or the European Union. We have time for only one more question, and yet it does not mean that the discussion and debate finishes here. We can continue our discussion over dinner. I'm convinced that our guests will be more than happy to answer your questions. So let us have one brief question and then continue. I'm sorry, the gentleman is not using the microphone, so I can't hear what he's saying. Is there a microphone somewhere? Well, I don't think this is so simple to accept. I'm so sorry, ma'am. I'm afraid we have to conclude because we're pressed for time. I'm convinced all our panelists will be available for your questions. So thank you all the panelists and thank you for your attention.